The morning sun cast long shadows across the entrance of Fort Braxton as Colonel Sarah Martinez pulled her rental car into the visitor parking area. She stepped out, adjusting her civilian clothes, a simple navy blazer, dark slacks, and comfortable flats. After 3 months of recovery from her combat injuries in Afghanistan, she was finally ready to take command of the 3rd Infantry Battalion. Today was supposed to be a quiet reconnaissance visit before her official arrival ceremony next week. Sarah had specifically requested this informal visit to observe her new unit without the usual pomp and ceremony that accompanied a change of command. She wanted to see how her soldiers operated when they thought no one important was watching. It was a leadership technique she had learned from her mentor, General Patricia Hayes, who always said, "You learn more about an organization in 5 minutes of unobserved behavior than in 5 hours of formal presentations." The main gate of Fort Braxton stood imposing before her, with its high concrete barriers and razor wire gleaming in the morning light. 2 guards manned the checkpoint, their uniforms crisp and weapons at the ready. Sarah approached the gate with her military identification card in hand, expecting the routine check that would grant her access to the base. Private First Class Tommy Rodriguez was in his 2nd year of service and took his gate duty seriously. When he saw a woman in civilian clothes approaching, he immediately went into standard protocol mode. His training kicked in as he noticed she didn't look like the typical spouse or contractor who usually visited the base during morning hours. "Good morning, ma'am," Rodriguez said politely but firmly. "I'll need to see some identification and know the purpose of your visit today." Sarah smiled and handed over her military ID card. "Good morning, Private. I'm here for a facility tour and to meet with some personnel." Rodriguez examined the card carefully, noting the rank of colonel and the name Sarah Martinez. However, something seemed off to him. The woman before him looked too young to be a full colonel, and her casual attire didn't match what he expected from a senior officer. In his limited experience, colonels were older men who wore their uniforms with pride, not young women in business casual clothing. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to wait here while I verify this identification," Rodriguez said, stepping back toward the guard shack. "This doesn't look right to me." His partner, Sergeant Mike Chen, had been watching the interaction from inside the booth. Chen had been in the Army for 8 years and had seen his share of people trying to gain unauthorized access to military installations. He trusted Rodriguez's instincts and decided to take a closer look at the situation himself. "Is there a problem here?" Chen asked, approaching Sarah with a skeptical expression. "No problem at all, Sergeant," Sarah replied calmly. "I'm simply here for a scheduled visit to tour the facilities." Chen took the ID card from Rodriguez and examined it under the scanner. The card came back as legitimate, showing Colonel Sarah Martinez, but something still felt wrong to both guards. They had never heard of a female colonel being assigned to Fort Braxton, and the woman before them didn't fit their mental image of what a colonel should look like. "Ma'am, this ID shows you as a colonel, but I'm not showing any appointments or visits scheduled for today," Chen said, checking his computer terminal. "And honestly, you don't look like any colonel I've ever seen." Sarah felt a mix of frustration and curiosity. She could easily resolve this situation by making a phone call or demanding to speak with the officer of the day, but she was genuinely interested in how this would play out. This interaction was already teaching her valuable lessons about her new command. "What exactly does a colonel look like, Sergeant?" Sarah asked, her voice remaining pleasant but with a slight edge that both guards missed entirely. "Well, ma'am, they're usually, older guys, military bearing, uniforms, that sort of thing," Chen replied, completely oblivious to how his words might sound to an actual colonel. "You look more like someone who might work in administration or maybe a spouse coming to visit." Rodriguez nodded in agreement. "Yeah, and usually when high-ranking officers visit, we get advance notice. There's protocols and stuff. Security details. This just doesn't feel right." Sarah realized she was witnessing exactly the kind of assumptions and biases that had followed her throughout her military career. Despite her combat decorations, her Bronze Star, her Purple Heart, and her 15 years of distinguished service, these soldiers saw a woman in civilian clothes and immediately assumed she couldn't possibly be who her identification said she was. "I understand your caution," Sarah said carefully. "Security is important, but my identification is legitimate and I do have business on this base." "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside while we figure this out," Chen said, his tone becoming more authoritative. We can't just let people walk onto the base because they have an ID that might be fake. Might be fake, Sarah repeated, raising an eyebrow. Well, yeah, Rodriguez chimed in. I mean, anyone can get a fake ID made these days, and like Sergeant Chen said, you just don't look like Colonel material. No offense, ma'am, but colonels are serious military leaders. They've got that command presence, you know. Sarah bit back a smile. Command presence was something she had been told she lacked early in her career, not because she didn't possess leadership qualities, but because she didn't fit the traditional mold of what people expected a leader to look like. Over the years, she had learned that true command presence wasn't about looking the part. It was about earning respect through competence, integrity, and results. And what would you do if I actually was a colonel? Sarah asked, genuinely curious about their answer. Chen and Rodriguez exchanged glances, clearly thinking this was a hypothetical question. Well, if you were really a colonel, you'd probably be pretty upset with us right now, Rodriguez admitted. But you're being so nice about it, which kind of proves you're not really a colonel. Real colonels don't take this kind of questioning so well. Plus, Chen added, if you were really a colonel, you'd be demanding to speak to our commanding officer or something. You'd be all angry and pulling rank. That's what officers do when they don't get their way. Sarah found their reasoning fascinating and deeply troubling at the same time. These soldiers had such a narrow view of leadership that they couldn't conceive of a senior officer who might handle a situation with patience and curiosity rather than anger and intimidation. Have you considered that maybe different officers handle situations differently? Sarah asked. Not really, ma'am, Chen replied honestly. In my experience, officers are pretty predictable. They like things done their way and they don't like being questioned, especially not by enlisted guys like us. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another vehicle at the gate. A black SUV with government plates pulled up behind Sarah's rental car, and a man in military uniform stepped out. This was Captain James Wilson, the officer of the day, who had been alerted by the guards about a potential security issue. What's the situation here? Wilson asked, approaching the group with an air of authority. Sir, we've got a lady here claiming to be a colonel, but her story doesn't check out, Chen reported. She's got an ID that might be fake, and she doesn't look like any colonel I've ever seen. Wilson looked at Sarah, taking in her civilian attire and young appearance. Like his subordinates, he found it difficult to believe that this woman could be a senior military officer. Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to provide additional identification and explain exactly why you're here, Wilson said, his tone professional but skeptical. Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out her driver's license and military-dependent ID card, handing them to Wilson along with her original military ID. Captain Wilson, Sarah said, reading his name tag, I'm here for an informal facility tour before my official arrival next week. I wanted to observe normal operations without the usual fanfare. Wilson examined the documents carefully. Everything appeared legitimate, but like his guards, he couldn't reconcile the woman before him with his expectations of what a colonel should be. Ma'am, if you're really a colonel, then you should understand our security concerns, Wilson said. We can't be too careful about who we let on base, especially in today's security environment. I absolutely understand and appreciate your diligence, Sarah replied, but I'm curious about what specific security concerns my appearance raises. Wilson found himself in an awkward position. He couldn't exactly say that she looked too young or too female to be a colonel, but that was exactly what was bothering him about the situation. Well, ma'am, it's just that we usually receive advance notice when senior officers visit, Wilson said, grasping for a legitimate reason to deny entry. And typically, colonels travel in military vehicles with appropriate escorts. And they're usually men, Rodriguez added helpfully, immediately realizing he had said something he shouldn't have. An uncomfortable silence fell over the group as Wilson shot Rodriguez a sharp look. The private's comment had revealed the underlying bias that was driving their resistance to allowing Sarah on base. Private Rodriguez raises an interesting point, Sarah said calmly. Tell me, how many female colonels have you encountered in your careers? The question caught all three men off guard. Wilson thought for a moment and realized he had never actually served under a female colonel, though he knew they existed. Chen and Rodriguez had no experience with female officers above the rank of captain. That's not really relevant, ma'am, Wilson said, trying to regain control of the situation. We're just following standard security protocols. Of course, Sarah agreed. And part of good security is knowing who's supposed to be on your base, isn't it, Captain? Wilson nodded, unsure where she was going with this line of questioning. So tell me, Captain Wilson, who is scheduled to take command of the 3rd Infantry Battalion next week. Wilson's face went pale as the implication of her question hit him. He frantically searched his memory for the name of the incoming commander, a detail he should have known, but had somehow overlooked in the chaos of daily operations. I'll need to check on that, ma'am, Wilson stammered, suddenly realizing that he might have made a significant mistake. Please do, Sarah said pleasantly. And while you're checking, perhaps you could also verify whether Colonel Sarah Martinez is expected to arrive for an informal reconnaissance visit today. The color drained from Rodriguez's face as he heard the name spoken aloud. Chen stepped backward, his hand unconsciously moving toward his weapon in a nervous gesture that he immediately corrected. Wilson quickly pulled out his phone and made a call to the battalion headquarters. The conversation was brief but enlightening, as Sarah could see the captain's expression change from skepticism to horror to barely controlled panic. Ma'am, Wilson said after ending the call, his voice noticeably different. I've just been informed that Colonel Sarah Martinez is indeed expected today, and that she is the incoming battalion commander. That's correct, Captain, Sarah replied, maintaining her calm demeanor. Ma'am, this is highly irregular, Wilson struggled to find the right words. Your appearance, we weren't expecting. You weren't expecting a woman, Sarah finished for him. Or someone my age, or someone in civilian clothes. I understand, Captain, this has been quite educational. Rodriguez and Chen stood frozen, realizing they had just spent the better part of 30 minutes refusing entry to their new commanding officer, and questioning her legitimacy based on their preconceived notions about what a colonel should look like. Colonel Martinez, Wilson said, his voice now showing proper respect tinged with fear, please accept my apologies for this misunderstanding. We were simply following protocols, Sarah interrupted. I heard you the first time, Captain, and I appreciate that you take security seriously. However, I think we need to have a conversation about how those protocols are applied and what assumptions might be influencing your security decisions. The weight of their mistake was beginning to settle on all 3 men. They had not only denied access to a full colonel, but had done so based on gender and age discrimination that could have serious consequences for their careers. Ma'am, if we could just start over, Chen suggested desperately. We could process your entry properly and— Sergeant Chen, Sarah said, her voice still calm but now carrying unmistakable authority, we're well past the point of starting over. What's done is done, and now we need to figure out what we're going to learn from this experience. As Sarah spoke, her command presence, the very quality Rodriguez and Chen had claimed she lacked, filled the space around the gate. Without raising her voice or making threats, she had completely shifted the dynamic of the interaction. The guards who had been so confident in their assessment of her just minutes before now stood at attention, recognizing the authority they had failed to see earlier. Now, Sarah continued, I'm going to enter this base and I'm going to conduct my planned reconnaissance. Captain Wilson, you're going to escort me personally, and we're going to have a detailed conversation about training, protocols, and unconscious bias. Sergeants Chen and Rodriguez, you're going to spend the rest of your shift thinking very carefully about what just happened here and what you might do differently in the future. Yes, ma'am, all 3 men replied in unison, their voices reflecting a mixture of respect, embarrassment, and genuine concern about the consequences of their actions. As the gate finally opened to admit Colonel Sarah Martinez to her new command, she reflected on the irony of the situation. She had come to observe her soldiers without their knowledge, and instead, she had learned more about the challenges facing her leadership than any formal briefing could have provided. The real reconnaissance was just beginning. Captain Wilson's hands shook slightly as he drove the government SUV through the winding roads of Fort Braxton, stealing nervous glances at Colonel Martinez in the passenger seat. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken tension, broken only by the hum of the vehicle's engine and the distant sounds of military training exercises echoing across the base. Sarah watched the familiar sights of a military installation pass by, soldiers in formation, equipment yards filled with vehicles, administrative buildings that house the complex machinery of military bureaucracy. Everything looked standard from the outside, but she knew that real understanding came from looking beneath the surface. Colonel Martinez, Wilson finally broke the silence, his voice carefully measured. I want you to know that what happened at the gate doesn't represent the values of this battalion. We pride ourselves on professionalism and— Captain, Sarah interrupted gently, right now I'm more interested in understanding than in hearing apologies. Tell me about your soldiers. How long have Rodriguez and Chen been at this assignment? Wilson seemed surprised by the question but answered readily. Rodriguez has been here about 18 months, ma'am. He's a good soldier, follows orders, stays out of trouble. Chen transferred in about 2 years ago from Fort Riley. He's got solid experience and has been helpful training the newer personnel. And their gate duty, how often do they interact with officers? Well, ma'am, mostly they see captains and below. The occasional major from brigade headquarters. We don't get many colonel-level visits to the battalion. Sarah nodded, filing away this information. The isolation of junior enlisted personnel from senior leadership was a common problem in military units, creating information gaps that bred assumptions and stereotypes. What about female officers, Captain? How many serve in leadership positions in the battalion? Wilson's discomfort was visible as he considered the question. We have Lieutenant Sarah Kim in Alpha Company and Captain Jennifer Ross in the Support Company. They're both excellent officers, ma'am. 2 female officers in a battalion of how many personnel? Approximately 450 soldiers, ma'am. Sarah did the math quickly. Less than 0.5% female officers in the unit. While infantry battalions traditionally had lower female representation due to combat exclusion policies that had only recently changed, the numbers still painted a clear picture of why her presence had been so unexpected. They pulled up to the battalion headquarters, a 2-story brick building that had seen decades of military service. Soldiers moved purposefully around the area, some carrying equipment, others heading to various appointments and duties. Sarah noticed how they walked, how they interacted with each other, the subtle indicators that revealed unit morale and discipline. Captain, I'd like to observe normal operations for a while before announcing my presence, Sarah said as they parked. Is there somewhere I can watch how things function on a typical day? Wilson looked uncertain. Ma'am, perhaps it would be better if I introduced you to the staff right away. They should know who you are. Why, so they can perform instead of operating normally? Sarah's question carried gentle challenge. I'll be leading these soldiers for the next 2 years, Captain. I need to see who they really are, not who they pretend to be when a colonel is watching. Reluctantly, Wilson led her into the building through a side entrance that opened into a common area where several soldiers were taking a break between training sessions. Sarah positioned herself at a table with a clear view of the room and pulled out a notebook, appearing for all the world like a civilian contractor or administrative visitor. The conversation among the soldiers was revealing. Sergeant First Class Maria Gonzalez was explaining to a group of junior NCOs the challenges of getting equipment requests approved through the battalion's bureaucratic process. I've been trying to get new communications equipment for 3 months, Gonzalez said with obvious frustration. Every request gets kicked back for more justification or additional forms. Meanwhile, we're expected to maintain readiness with equipment that should have been replaced years ago. A young corporal named David Park nodded in agreement. Same thing happened when Alpha Company requested updated training materials. They told us to make do with what we have, but what we have doesn't match current doctrine or equipment. Sarah made notes as she listened, recognizing the classic symptoms of an organization that had become more focused on process than results. These were good soldiers being hindered by systems that prioritized paperwork over mission accomplishment. The new co is supposed to arrive next week, another soldier mentioned. Maybe things will change then. Don't count on it, Park replied cynically. New commanders always come in talking about change, but they usually just rearrange the same old problems. Besides, I heard the new colonel is some kind of desk jockey who got promoted for political reasons. Sarah's pen stopped moving as she heard this assessment. She was curious about where these rumors had originated and what they revealed about the battalion's information flow. Where did you hear that? Gonzalez asked. Top Sergeant mentioned it to some of the other NCOs. Park replied. Said the new colonel never led anything bigger than a company and got fast-tracked because of diversity quotas. The comment hit Sarah like a physical blow, not because it was personally hurtful, but because it revealed the toxic assumptions that could undermine unit cohesion before she even took command. She had encountered similar attitudes throughout her career, but hearing it discussed so casually among her future subordinates was particularly disheartening. Wilson, who had been listening to the same conversation, looked mortified. He started to stand, presumably to intervene, but Sarah placed a gentle hand on his arm to stop him. "Let them talk," she whispered. "This is exactly what I needed to hear." The conversation continued with other soldiers sharing their own theories about the incoming commander. Some expressed hope for positive changes, while others seemed resigned to disappointment. Through it all, Sarah noticed that the female soldiers in the group remained largely silent, their faces reflecting the complex emotions of serving in an environment where their competence was constantly questioned. Lieutenant Kim entered the common area and approached Gonzalez with a document that needed review. Sarah observed the interaction carefully, noting how the male soldier's body language subtly changed when the female officer appeared. There was respect, but it seemed cautious and conditional, as if Kim had to continuously prove her worthiness for the respect that male officers received automatically. "Lieutenant Kim," one of the soldiers called out after she had finished her business with Gonzalez, "is it true that the new battalion commander is a woman?" Kim paused, clearly uncomfortable with the question. "I haven't received any official information about the new commander's identity," she replied diplomatically. "Come on, LT," Park pressed. "You must have heard something through officer channels." "Corporal Park, you know I can't discuss personnel matters that haven't been officially announced," Kim said firmly but kindly. "But if it is true," another soldier interjected, "do you think a female colonel can handle an infantry battalion? I mean, no disrespect to you, ma'am, but battalion command is different from company leadership." The question revealed the deep-seated doubts that permeated the unit's culture. Even soldiers who respected their female officers on a personal level struggled to envision female leadership at higher levels. Kim's response was measured and professional. "I think any officer who reaches the rank of colonel has proven their competence through years of service and demonstrated leadership ability. The Army doesn't promote people to battalion command without ensuring they're qualified for the responsibility." "But still," Park persisted, "there's got to be a reason why we've never had a female battalion commander before. Maybe infantry units are different from other kinds of commands." Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions as she listened to this exchange. Park wasn't being intentionally disrespectful, but his comments reflected the systemic barriers that female officers faced throughout their careers. His questioning wasn't rooted in personal animosity, but in cultural assumptions that were so deeply embedded he probably wasn't even aware of them. Wilson leaned over to Sarah and whispered urgently, "Ma'am, I think we should intervene. This conversation is inappropriate." "Why?" Sarah whispered back. "They're having an honest discussion about legitimate concerns. Shutting it down won't change their thinking, it will just drive it underground." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Command Sergeant Major Robert Hayes, an imposing man with nearly 20 years of service who commanded instant respect from every soldier in the room. The casual atmosphere immediately shifted to one of professional attention. "Afternoon, soldiers," Hayes said, his voice carrying the authority of years of leadership experience. "I hope everyone's making productive use of their break time." "Yes, Sergeant Major," came the unified response. Hayes noticed Sarah sitting at the corner table and approached with the practiced eye of a senior NCO who could spot unusual situations from across a room. "Ma'am, I don't believe we've met," Hayes said politely. "I'm Command Sergeant Major Hayes. Can I help you with something?" Sarah stood and extended her hand. "I'm Sarah Martinez. I'm here for a facility tour and to observe normal operations." Hayes shook her hand with a firm grip, his experienced gaze taking in details that the gate guards had missed. Unlike the younger soldiers, Hayes had served with enough senior officers to recognize leadership bearing even in civilian clothes. "Ms. Martinez," Hayes said thoughtfully, "might I ask what organization you're touring for?" "I'm conducting a personal reconnaissance," Sarah replied honestly. "I'll be working here soon and wanted to understand the environment." Hayes' eyes narrowed slightly as he processed this information. Unlike Wilson and his gate guards, the command sergeant major was asking the right questions and paying attention to subtle cues. "Ma'am, would you mind if I verified your identification?" Hayes asked respectfully but firmly. Sarah handed over her military ID without hesitation. Hayes examined it carefully, and she watched recognition dawn in his eyes. His posture immediately shifted to attention as he realized exactly who he was speaking with. "Colonel Martinez," Hayes said, his voice now carrying a mixture of respect and concern. "Welcome to Fort Braxton. I apologize that your arrival wasn't handled with appropriate protocol." The formal address caught the attention of every soldier in the common area. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as they processed the implications of what they had just heard. The woman they had been casually discussing was standing right there, having listened to every word of their conversation. Lieutenant Kim's face went pale as she realized she had just been defending her new commanding officer to soldiers who had been openly questioning the colonel's qualifications, while the colonel herself was sitting 20 feet away. Park looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. His earlier confidence completely evaporated as he understood the magnitude of his mistake. Gonzalez, with the quick thinking of an experienced NCO, immediately called the room to attention. "Battalion commander present." Every soldier in the area snapped to attention with precision that spoke well of their training and discipline, even as their faces reflected varying degrees of shock, embarrassment, and apprehension. Sarah surveyed the room full of soldiers standing at attention, their faces showing the complex emotions of people who had just realized they had been caught in a moment of unguarded honesty. Rather than feeling angry or disappointed, she felt oddly grateful for the opportunity to understand the real challenges she would face as their commander. "As you were," Sarah said calmly, and the soldiers relaxed slightly though their wariness remained evident. Hayes stepped forward, his leadership instincts taking over. "Colonel, would you like me to assemble the staff for a proper introduction?" "In a moment, Command Sergeant Major," Sarah replied. "First, I'd like to address the soldiers who were just sharing their thoughts about their new commander." The room fell silent again, as everyone waited to see how the colonel would handle the awkward situation they had created through their candid conversation about her qualifications and appointment. Sarah looked around the room at the faces of her future soldiers, each one reflecting a different stage of processing the uncomfortable reality that their new commanding officer had heard every word of their unfiltered conversation. The silence stretched for several seconds before she spoke, her voice calm and measured. "Corporal Park," Sarah said, addressing the young soldier directly, "you mentioned hearing that I got promoted due to diversity quotas. I'm curious about your source for that information." Park's face flushed red as he realized he was being called out specifically. "Ma'am, it was just something I heard through the grapevine. I didn't mean any disrespect." "I'm not questioning your intent, Corporal. I'm interested in understanding how information flows through this unit." Sarah's tone remained conversational rather than confrontational. Rumors and speculation can reveal important truths about organizational culture, even when the facts they're based on are incorrect. Hayes watched this exchange with growing appreciation for his new commander's approach. Many officers would have used this situation to assert dominance or make examples of the soldiers involved. Instead, Colonel Martinez seemed genuinely interested in learning from the awkward encounter. "Sergeant Gonzalez," Sarah continued, turning to the experienced NCO who had called the room to attention, "you mentioned having trouble getting equipment requests approved. How long has this been an ongoing issue?" Gonzalez hesitated, clearly uncertain whether this was the appropriate time or place for such a discussion. "Ma'am, it's been a persistent challenge for about 8 months since the last change in our support structure." "And what kind of impact has this had on training and readiness?" "Significant impact, ma'am," Gonzalez replied, her confidence growing as she realized the colonel was asking substantive operational questions rather than simply addressing the earlier inappropriate comments. "We've had to modify training exercises, reduce certain types of practice scenarios, and in some cases postpone qualification requirements." Sarah nodded, making mental notes of another issue that would require her immediate attention once she officially took command. The conversation was revealing systemic problems that went far beyond the personal biases she had encountered at the gate. "Lieutenant Kim," Sarah said, shifting her attention to the young officer who had handled the earlier questioning with such professionalism. "What's been your experience with these equipment and resource challenges?" Kim straightened slightly, recognizing the opportunity to provide valuable input to her new commander. "Ma'am, it's been frustrating from a leadership perspective. My soldiers want to train to standard, but we're often asking them to accomplish full-scale objectives with limited resources. It puts junior leaders in difficult positions when they have to explain why we can't provide proper equipment for training." "And how do your soldiers respond to those explanations?" "With understanding, mostly, but also with growing skepticism about our priorities as an organization," Kim admitted. "They see other units getting new equipment while we're told to make do with outdated gear." Sarah appreciated the lieutenant's honesty. It took courage for a junior officer to admit organizational shortcomings to a new colonel, especially in front of enlisted personnel. "Command Sergeant Major Hayes," Sarah said, turning to the senior NCO. "What's your assessment of morale and readiness given these challenges?" Hayes considered his response carefully. As the senior enlisted advisor, his perspective would carry significant weight with both the soldiers and the new commander. "Ma'am, we have good soldiers who want to excel, but they're operating within systems that don't always support excellence," Hayes said diplomatically. "The equipment issues Sergeant Gonzalez mentioned are real, but they're symptoms of larger problems with our supply chain and approval processes." "And the rumors about my qualifications and appointment?" Sarah asked directly. "How do those kinds of assumptions affect unit cohesion and confidence in leadership?" The question put Hayes in a delicate position. He needed to be honest about the challenges while not throwing his soldiers under the bus for their earlier comments. "Ma'am, soldiers talk. It's part of military culture," Hayes began carefully. "When there's limited information about changes in leadership, people fill in the gaps with speculation. Sometimes that speculation reflects broader concerns about fairness and merit that go beyond any individual commander." Sarah recognized the diplomatic skill in Hayes' response. He was acknowledging the problem without making excuses for it, while also contextualizing the soldiers' comments within larger organizational issues. "That's a fair assessment, Command Sergeant Major," Sarah replied. "And it brings up an important question for everyone in this room. How do we ensure that evaluations of leadership are based on performance and competence rather than assumptions about gender, age, or appearance?" Park, who had been standing uncomfortably since his earlier comments, finally found his voice. "Ma'am, I realize now that what I said was inappropriate. I made assumptions without any factual basis." "Corporal Park, your assumptions weren't formed in a vacuum," Sarah replied thoughtfully. "They reflect cultural messages you've received throughout your military experience about what leadership looks like and how promotions work. My question is, what would help you and other soldiers evaluate leadership based on actual performance rather than demographics?" The question caught Park off guard because it wasn't accusatory. Instead, the colonel seemed to be asking for his input on solving a problem rather than punishing him for being part of it. "I guess, maybe if we knew more about leaders' actual experience and accomplishments," Park suggested tentatively. "Instead of just hearing rumors, maybe official information about what commanders have done in their careers." "That's a constructive suggestion," Sarah agreed. "What else might help?" Gonzalez raised her hand slightly. "Ma'am, maybe more opportunities for soldiers to interact with senior leaders in informal settings. Sometimes the distance between ranks creates space for rumors to grow." "Another good point," Sarah acknowledged. "Lieutenant Kim, what's your perspective on this?" "Ma'am, I think transparency about decision-making processes might help," Kim offered. "When soldiers understand why certain choices are made, they're less likely to assume political motivations." Sarah was pleased with the direction the conversation was taking. What had started as an awkward confrontation about inappropriate assumptions was evolving into a productive discussion about leadership and organizational culture. "These are all valuable insights," Sarah said. "Now let me share some information that might provide context for your earlier questions about my qualifications." The room's attention focused completely on Sarah, as she prepared to address the elephant in the room directly. "I've served 15 years in the Army, including 3 combat deployments in Afghanistan and Iraq." I've commanded at the company level in combat operations, served as a battalion operations officer during counterinsurgency operations, and most recently completed a fellowship at the Army War College focused on unit cohesion and effectiveness. She paused, letting this information sink in before continuing. I've been awarded the Bronze Star for actions during a firefight where my company held a critical position against superior enemy forces for 6 hours until relief arrived. I received the Purple Heart when an IED destroyed my vehicle during a convoy operation, and I was back on duty 3 days later with a patched-up arm and a determination to complete the mission. The soldiers listened intently as Sarah shared these details, their expressions shifting as they processed information that contradicted their earlier assumptions about her background. "I'm not sharing these details to prove my worth to you," Sarah continued. "I'm sharing them because you deserve to know who's leading you, just as I deserve the chance to lead based on my actual qualifications rather than your assumptions about what a colonel should look like." Hayes nodded approvingly, recognizing the leadership technique of sharing personal credentials to establish credibility without appearing to boast. "Ma'am," Park said hesitantly, "I owe you an apology for my earlier comments. I made judgments without any factual basis." "Corporal Park, your apology is accepted, but more importantly, what will you do differently going forward?" Sarah asked. "I'll try to base my opinions on facts rather than assumptions, ma'am. And I'll speak up when I hear other soldiers making the same kinds of unfounded comments I made today." "That's exactly the kind of leadership I need from my NCOs," Sarah replied, nodding Park's corporal rank. "You have the potential to influence how this unit thinks about these issues." Gonzalez stepped forward slightly. "Ma'am, speaking for myself, I'm grateful you're addressing this directly rather than just writing us off for our earlier conversation. It shows a different kind of leadership approach than we're used to." "What kind of leadership approach are you used to, Sergeant?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious about the unit's previous experience. "Usually more top-down, ma'am, orders and expectations without much explanation or discussion. This conversation is different." Sarah smiled slightly. "Sergeant Gonzalez, effective leadership requires understanding the people you're leading. I can't command effectively if I don't understand the challenges, concerns, and perspectives of my soldiers." Hayes stepped forward, recognizing an opportunity to begin transitioning from this impromptu discussion to more formal proceedings. "Colonel Martinez, would you like me to arrange for you to meet with the company commanders and staff officers?" Hayes asked. "Yes, but first I want to continue this conversation with a broader group," Sarah replied. "Command Sergeant Major, would it be possible to gather the NCO Corps for an informal discussion? I think the issues we've been exploring affect the entire unit, not just the soldiers who happen to be in this room." Hayes looked surprised by the request. It was unusual for a new commander to want to address the NCO Corps before meeting with the officer staff, but he could see the wisdom in the approach. "Ma'am, I can have the NCOs assembled in about 20 minutes, Hayes confirmed. "Excellent, and Captain Wilson," Sarah turned to the officer who had been quietly observing the entire exchange. "I'd like you to participate in that discussion as well. The assumptions and biases we've been talking about affect all levels of the organization." Wilson nodded, though he still looked uncomfortable about his role in the gate incident and uncertain about what kind of discussion the colonel had in mind. "Before we break up this group," Sarah said, addressing all the soldiers present, "I want to make something clear. What happened here today, both at the gate and in this room, has been educational for everyone involved. I'm not interested in punishment or recrimination. I'm interested in learning and improvement." She looked around the room, making eye contact with each soldier. "You've shown me that this unit has intelligent, thoughtful soldiers who care about their organization and their mission. You've also shown me that we have cultural challenges that affect how we evaluate leadership and make assumptions about competence. Both of these observations will influence how I approach command of this battalion." The soldiers stood a little straighter, recognizing that their new commander was treating them as intelligent professionals rather than subordinates who needed to be lectured about their mistakes. "Dismissed," Sarah said, and the soldiers began to file out of the room, their conversations noticeably more subdued and thoughtful than when she had first observed them. As the common area cleared, Sarah found herself alone with Hayes, Wilson, and Lieutenant Kim, who had remained behind. "Colonel, Hayes said once the other soldiers were out of earshot. That was masterfully handled. You turned a potentially damaging situation into a learning opportunity for everyone involved. Thank you, Command Sergeant Major. But the real test will be whether we can build on this foundation to create lasting change in how this unit operates. Kim stepped forward hesitantly. Ma'am, if I may say so, your approach gives me hope that we can address some of the systemic issues that have been affecting morale and effectiveness. Sarah looked at the young lieutenant with interest. Lieutenant Kim, I suspect you have insights into this organization that could be valuable. I'd like to schedule some time to hear your perspective on the challenges and opportunities you've observed. Yes, ma'am, I'd be honored to share my observations. Wilson cleared his throat. Colonel Martinez, I feel I should address my role in this morning's incident at the gate. The delays and questioning you experienced were unacceptable. Captain Wilson, what happened this morning revealed important information about this unit's culture and assumptions. While the experience was frustrating, it was also instructive. The question now is what we're going to do with that information. As Sarah prepared to meet with the broader NCO Corps, she reflected on how much she had learned in just a few hours of informal observation. The challenges facing this battalion were more complex than simple equipment shortages or administrative inefficiencies. They involved deep-seated cultural assumptions about leadership, competence, and authority that would require careful and sustained effort to address. But she had also seen signs of hope. Soldiers who could acknowledge their mistakes and commit to improvement, NCOs who cared about their unit's effectiveness, and officers who were willing to engage honestly with difficult questions. With the right approach, this could become the kind of unit where excellence was defined by performance rather than conformity to traditional expectations. The battalion conference room filled slowly as NCOs from across the unit responded to Command Sergeant Major Hayes' unusual summons. Staff sergeants, sergeants first class, and senior sergeants filed in with expressions of curiosity and mild apprehension. Word had already begun spreading through the informal communication networks that existed in every military unit about the incident at the gate and the new colonel's unconventional introduction. Sarah positioned herself at the front of the room, still in her civilian clothes, watching as the NCO Corps assembled. These were the backbone of any military unit, the experienced leaders who translated officer intent into action, who mentored junior soldiers, and who maintained the daily operations that kept the battalion functioning. Sergeant First Class Jennifer Walsh entered with two other NCOs from Bravo Company, their conversation stopping abruptly when they noticed the woman in civilian attire standing at the front of the room. Walsh had 12 years of service and had heard the rumors about their new commander, but like many others, she had assumed those rumors were exaggerated or incorrect. "Is that her?" Walsh whispered to Sergeant Marcus Thompson, who had just arrived from the motor pool with grease still on his hands from working on a vehicle. "Must be," Thompson replied quietly. "Hayes looks pretty serious, and Wilson's sitting up front like he's in trouble." Master Sergeant Kevin O'Brien, the senior NCO from Alpha Company, took a seat in the front row and studied Sarah with the calculating gaze of someone who had seen many commanders come and go during his 16 years of service. O'Brien had developed a talent for quickly assessing new leadership based on subtle cues, body language, how they interacted with different ranks, and whether their words matched their actions. As the room filled to capacity, Sarah noticed the seating patterns that emerged naturally. Senior NCOs gravitated toward the front, while junior sergeants clustered toward the back. The few female NCOs in the room seemed to position themselves strategically, not isolated, but also not prominently displayed. It was a familiar dynamic that spoke to the complex social structures within military units. Command Sergeant Major Hayes called the room to attention as Sarah stepped forward to address the group. "Take your seats," Sarah said immediately, preferring to begin with a more relaxed atmosphere than formal military protocol typically allowed. "Command Sergeant Major Hayes, thank you for gathering everyone on short notice." Hayes nodded from his position at the side of the room, his experienced eye monitoring the NCO's reactions to their new commander's informal approach. "I'm Colonel Sarah Martinez, and as of next week, I'll be your battalion commander," Sarah began, her voice carrying easily through the room without needing to be raised. "Today was supposed to be a quiet reconnaissance visit to observe normal operations before my official arrival. Instead, it's become an educational experience that I think we all need to discuss." Staff Sergeant Rebecca Chen, who worked in the battalion communications section, shifted uncomfortably in her seat as she remembered conversations she had participated in just yesterday about the incoming commander. Like many others in the room, she was beginning to realize that casual speculation about leadership could have consequences when that leadership was actually listening. This morning, I was denied entry to this base by gate guards who determined that I didn't look like a colonel, Sarah continued matter-of-factly. Their decision was based on my gender, my apparent age, and my civilian clothing rather than on my legitimate military identification. A murmur ran through the room as NCOs exchanged glances. Some looked uncomfortable, others appeared genuinely surprised by this revelation. After eventually gaining entry, I observed soldiers in your common area discussing their concerns about having a female battalion commander who they assumed was unqualified and had been promoted due to diversity initiatives rather than merit. The uncomfortable shifting in seats became more pronounced as Sarah's words hit home for several NCOs who had participated in similar conversations. Now, Sarah said, her tone remaining conversational rather than accusatory, I'm not here to lecture you about political correctness or to punish anyone for honest opinions. I'm here because these incidents reveal important truths about our organizational culture that will affect our mission effectiveness. Master Sergeant O'Brien leaned forward slightly, recognizing that the colonel was approaching this situation differently than he had expected. Sergeant First Class Walsh, Sarah said, nodding the nameplate of one of the NCOs who had entered while whispering. What do you think happens to unit cohesion when soldiers assume their leaders are unqualified before ever working with them? Walsh looked surprised to be addressed directly, but answered thoughtfully. Ma'am, it undermines confidence in leadership decisions and creates resistance to new initiatives before they're even implemented. Exactly right, Sarah agreed. And Sergeant Thompson, how does that resistance affect mission accomplishment? Thompson wiped his hands nervously on his uniform, still slightly flustered by the direct attention. Ma'am, it makes everything harder. If soldiers don't trust their leaders, they'll follow orders but without the enthusiasm and initiative that make the difference between success and excellence. Outstanding observation, Sarah replied. Now, Master Sergeant O'Brien, in your experience, what creates trust between leaders and their subordinates? O'Brien considered the question carefully, aware that his answer would be closely watched by the other NCOs in the room. Ma'am, trust comes from demonstrated competence, consistent decision-making, and leaders who show genuine concern for their soldiers' welfare and professional development, O'Brien replied. All true, Sarah acknowledged. But what happens when cultural assumptions prevent soldiers from recognizing competence when they see it? The question hung in the air as the NCOs processed its implications. Several exchanged meaningful looks as they realized the colonel was leading them to confront their own biases. Staff Sergeant Chen raised her hand slightly. Ma'am, it creates a situation where leaders have to overcome additional obstacles to prove themselves, obstacles that may have nothing to do with their actual abilities. Precisely, Sarah said. And those obstacles don't just affect the leader, they affect the entire organization's efficiency and effectiveness. Sergeant First Class David Martinez from Charlie Company spoke up without being prompted. Colonel, are you saying that our assumptions about leadership are holding back the unit's performance? What do you think, Sergeant Martinez? Sarah responded, turning the question back to him. Martinez thought for a moment before answering. Well, ma'am, if we're making decisions based on what we think leaders should look like instead of what they actually accomplish, then yeah, we're probably missing opportunities and creating problems that don't need to exist. Hayes watched this exchange with growing appreciation for his new commander's teaching technique. Rather than simply delivering information, she was guiding the NCOs to discover important truths for themselves. Let me share some information that might be relevant to your evaluations of my qualifications, Sarah said, moving to her next point. I've served in combat operations in both Afghanistan and Iraq, commanded troops under fire, and have been decorated for actions that required both tactical competence and personal courage. She walked slowly around the room as she spoke, making eye contact with different NCOs and nodding their changing expressions as they processed this information. I've also struggled with some of the same assumptions you're dealing with today. Early in my career, I was told I needed to be more aggressive to succeed in leadership roles. Later, when I demonstrated that aggressiveness, I was told I was too harsh. I've been questioned about my technical competence despite consistently high performance evaluations, and I've had soldiers initially resist my authority until I proved myself through actions rather than rank. Staff Sergeant Walsh found herself nodding as Sarah spoke, recognizing similar experiences from her own career progression. The point I'm making, Sarah continued, is that these cultural assumptions affect all of us, not just senior leaders. They influence how we evaluate each other, how we make promotion recommendations, and how we respond to new ideas and approaches. Sergeant Thompson raised his hand. Ma'am, how do we change assumptions that seem to be built into military culture? Outstanding question, Sergeant Thompson, Sarah replied. What's your suggestion? I don't know, ma'am. These attitudes seem pretty deeply rooted. They are deeply rooted, Sarah agreed, but that doesn't mean they can't be changed. Master Sergeant O'Brien, you've seen military culture evolve during your career. What drives those changes? O'Brien nodded thoughtfully. Leadership from the top, ma'am, but also peer pressure and examples that contradict existing assumptions. When soldiers see different kinds of leaders being successful, it changes their expectations. Exactly, Sarah said. And what role do NCOs play in that process? We're the ones who interact most directly with junior soldiers, O'Brien replied. Our attitudes and comments shape how they think about leadership and what they consider normal or acceptable. Command Sergeant Major Hayes stepped forward slightly, recognizing an opportunity to reinforce the colonel's message with his own authority. What Master Sergeant O'Brien just said is critical, Hayes added. Every comment you make about leadership, every assumption you express, and every bias you display gets passed down to your soldiers. You're not just following leaders, you're teaching future leaders what to expect. Staff Sergeant Chen spoke up again. So we have a responsibility to model the kind of thinking we want to see in our subordinates. That's exactly right, Sarah confirmed. And that brings me to the practical challenge we're facing as a battalion. She moved back to the front of the room, her posture and tone indicating a shift from theoretical discussion to concrete operational concerns. The equipment shortages, bureaucratic delays, and resource constraints that affect your daily operations are real problems that require immediate attention. But those problems are made worse when soldiers lose confidence in leadership's ability to solve them. Sergeant Martinez nodded vigorously. Ma'am, that's exactly what's been happening. Soldiers submit requests or identify problems, and when nothing happens, they start assuming leadership doesn't care or isn't competent enough to get results. Which creates a downward spiral, Sarah agreed. Reduced confidence leads to reduced effort, which leads to reduced results, which leads to further reduced confidence. So how do we break that cycle? Walsh asked. By demonstrating competence through results, Sarah replied simply, but also by addressing the cultural assumptions that make it harder for soldiers to recognize and support competent leadership when they see it. She looked around the room, noting the engaged expressions and active participation from NCOs who had initially seemed wary of this unconventional discussion. Here's what I'm proposing, Sarah continued. Over the next 90 days, we're going to work together to address both the practical operational problems and the cultural assumptions that undermine our effectiveness. Master Sergeant O'Brien leaned forward with interest. What would that look like in practice, ma'am? First, we're going to establish clear communication channels so that problems and solutions flow up and down the chain of command without getting lost in bureaucratic delays. Second, we're going to create opportunities for soldiers at all levels to interact with leadership in settings that allow for honest feedback and discussion. She paused, nodding the NCO's attentive faces. Third, we're going to examine our own assumptions and biases, not through sensitivity training or political correctness lectures, but through honest conversations about how those assumptions affect our mission accomplishment. Sergeant Thompson raised his hand again. Ma'am, how do we handle soldiers who resist these kinds of changes? The same way we handle resistance to any military directive, Sarah replied. Through leadership, example, and clear expectations, but also by demonstrating that these changes improve rather than hinder our effectiveness. Hayes stepped forward again. Colonel Martinez, what do you need from the NCO Corps to make this approach successful? I need your honest feedback about problems and potential solutions, Sarah replied. I need you to model the kind of thinking and behavior you want to see from your subordinates, and I need you to hold me accountable for the same standards of competence and integrity that I'll be expecting from all of you. The room fell quiet as the NCOs absorbed the implications of what their new commander was proposing. This was a very different approach from traditional command styles that relied primarily on hierarchy and authority. Staff Sergeant Chen broke the silence. Ma'am, this sounds like you're asking us to be partners in leadership rather than just implementers of decisions made above our level. That's exactly what I'm asking, Sarah confirmed. Because that's what effective leadership actually requires, regardless of what our traditional models might suggest. As the discussion concluded, Sarah could see that she had succeeded in challenging these experienced NCOs to think differently about leadership, culture, and organizational effectiveness. The real test would be whether these conversations could translate into meaningful changes in daily operations and long-term unit performance. 6 months after that eventful first day at Fort Braxton, Colonel Sarah Martinez stood before the same battalion headquarters building, but everything had changed. The morning air carried the sounds of a unit operating with precision and purpose, soldiers moving confidently between training areas, equipment being maintained properly, and conversations that reflected pride rather than frustration. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it certainly hadn't been without challenges. But as Sarah watched Master Sergeant O'Brien leading a group of visiting officers from another battalion on a tour of their facilities, she could see the tangible results of the cultural shifts they had worked so hard to implement. Colonel Martinez, Command Sergeant Major Hayes approached with a satisfied expression. The quarterly readiness report came in this morning. We're showing the highest scores in the brigade for both equipment readiness and training completion. Sarah nodded, pleased but not surprised by the news. When soldiers believed in their leadership and understood how their individual efforts contributed to unit success, performance improvements were almost inevitable. More importantly, Hayes continued, we're getting requests from other battalions asking about our training methods and leadership approaches. Seems like word is spreading about what we're accomplishing here. The success had indeed attracted attention from throughout the brigade and division. What had started as a necessity, addressing cultural assumptions that threatened unit effectiveness, had evolved into a model for organizational leadership that other commands wanted to understand and replicate. Lieutenant Kim, who had been promoted to Captain Kim and now commanded Alpha Company, approached with Sergeant First Class Walsh and Corporal Park, who was now Sergeant Park after his promotion 2 months earlier. Ma'am, Captain Kim said, we just finished the after-action review for this week's training exercise. The feedback from the evaluators was outstanding. Sarah smiled, remembering the nervous young lieutenant who had defended her new commander to skeptical soldiers 6 months ago. Kim's growth into a confident company commander had been one of many positive developments that emerged from the battalion's cultural transformation. What did the evaluators highlight specifically? Sarah asked. Sergeant Walsh stepped forward to answer. Ma'am, they said our unit showed exceptional adaptability and initiative at all levels. When unexpected situations arose during the exercise, soldiers responded with creative solutions instead of waiting for detailed instructions. And Sergeant Park added with evident pride, they specifically mentioned how well our leadership team worked together across all ranks and demographics. Sarah noted Park's emphasis on demographics. The young NCO who had once questioned whether a female colonel could command an infantry battalion had become one of the unit's most vocal advocates for evaluating leadership based on competence rather than assumptions. The transformation in Park's thinking hadn't happened through lectures or mandated training sessions. Instead, it had emerged from 6 months of observing actual leadership in action, working directly with officers and NCOs who proved their worth through daily performance, and participating in an organizational culture that rewarded results rather than conformity to traditional expectations. Speaking of the leadership team, Sarah said, how did the integrated planning session work out for the exercise? This was one of the innovations they had implemented, bringing together officers and senior NCOs from all companies to collaboratively plan training exercises and operational procedures. The approach had initially met with skepticism from some quarters, but the improved results had silenced most criticism. Captain Kim responded enthusiastically. "Ma'am, having the NCOs involved in the planning phase made a huge difference in execution. They identified potential problems we hadn't considered and suggested modifications that improved both safety and training value." The success of these integrated planning sessions had become one of the most visible symbols of the battalion's new approach to leadership and decision-making. Rather than relying solely on traditional hierarchical structures, they had created systems that leveraged expertise and experience regardless of where it existed within the organization. Master Sergeant O'Brien returned from his tour with the visiting officers, his expression reflecting satisfaction with the interest their unit was generating. "Colonel," O'Brien reported, "those officers from the 2nd Battalion were particularly interested in how we've improved our equipment readiness rates. They're dealing with some of the same bureaucratic delays we used to struggle with." Sarah remembered the frustrating equipment shortages and approval delays that had been symptomatic of larger organizational problems when she first arrived. Addressing those issues had required both practical solutions and cultural changes. "What did you tell them about our approach?" Sarah asked. "I explained how we streamlined the request and approval processes, but also how we changed the culture around problem-solving," O'Brien replied. "Instead of just complaining about delays or working around broken systems, we started treating every problem as an opportunity to improve how we operate." The cultural shift O'Brien described had been crucial to their success. Rather than accepting frustration and inefficiency as inevitable aspects of military bureaucracy, the battalion had developed a mindset focused on continuous improvement and proactive problem-solving. Sergeant Thompson approached the group, his uniform now bearing the stripes of a staff sergeant following his recent promotion. In his hands were maintenance reports that reflected the dramatic improvements in equipment readiness that had contributed to their high quarterly scores. "Ma'am," Thompson said, "the motor pool inspection results came in. We achieved a 96% readiness rate, up from 68% when you first arrived." The improvement in equipment maintenance hadn't just resulted from better procedures or increased resources. It had emerged from soldiers who felt invested in their unit's success and who understood how their individual contributions affected overall mission accomplishment. "Staff Sergeant Thompson," Sarah said, using his new rank with intentional emphasis, "what do you attribute the improvement to?" Thompson considered the question thoughtfully before answering. "Ma'am, I think it comes down to soldiers feeling like their work matters and that leadership will support them when they identify problems or suggest solutions." His answer captured an essential element of the transformation that had occurred throughout the battalion. When soldiers believed that their efforts were valued and that competent leadership would act on their input, performance improvements followed naturally. Captain Wilson, who had been working quietly to rebuild his reputation after the gate incident, joined the group with his own positive news. "Colonel Martinez," Wilson said, "the company commander's feedback on the new communication protocols has been overwhelmingly positive. They report much faster resolution of issues and better coordination between units." Wilson's recovery from his initial mistakes had become another example of the battalion's emphasis on learning and improvement, rather than punishment for honest errors. His efforts to understand and correct the assumptions that had led to the gate incident had earned him renewed respect from both his peers and his subordinates. "And Captain Wilson," Sarah added, "how has the feedback been from the gate guards and security personnel?" Wilson smiled slightly, remembering the awkward beginning of his relationship with his new commander. "Ma'am, they've implemented new protocols that focus on professional verification procedures rather than subjective assessments of who looks like they belong on base." The changes at the gate had become symbolic of broader cultural shifts throughout the installation. Security remained a priority, but procedures now relied on objective criteria rather than assumptions based on appearance or demographics. Command Sergeant Major Hayes approached with a document that brought news Sarah had been expecting. "Colonel," Hayes said with a mixture of pride and regret, "your promotion orders came through. Congratulations on making Brigadier General." The promotion represented recognition for the success Sarah had achieved at Fort Braxton, but it also meant leaving the battalion just as the transformation they had worked so hard to implement was showing its full potential. "Thank you, Command Sergeant Major," Sarah replied, "though I have to admit leaving now feels bittersweet." The soldiers gathered around her reflected various emotions as they processed the news. Pride in their commander's recognition competed with disappointment at losing the leader who had guided their unit's remarkable transformation. "Ma'am," Sergeant Park said, speaking for the group, "we're proud of your promotion, but we're also concerned about maintaining the changes we've made." Sarah looked around at the faces of soldiers who had grown so much during their time together. Park, who had evolved from making assumptions based on stereotypes to becoming an advocate for merit-based evaluation. Captain Kim, who had developed from a cautious junior officer to a confident company commander. Staff Sergeant Thompson, who had learned to see problems as opportunities for improvement. "Sergeant Park," Sarah replied, "the changes we've made aren't dependent on any individual leader. They're built into how you think, how you solve problems, and how you evaluate each other's performance." She addressed the broader group, wanting to ensure they understood the sustainability of their transformation. "What we've accomplished here isn't about having the right colonel or the perfect command climate. It's about creating a culture where competence is recognized and rewarded, where problems are addressed rather than ignored, and where every soldier's contribution is valued." Master Sergeant O'Brien nodded in agreement. "The colonel's right. The systems and attitudes we've developed will continue working regardless of who's in command, as long as we maintain our commitment to them." Command Sergeant Major Hayes stepped forward with the perspective that came from his years of experience with leadership transitions. "What makes this transformation sustainable," Hayes added, "is that it's improved our effectiveness in measurable ways. Future commanders will have strong incentives to maintain approaches that produce superior results." Sarah felt confident that Hayes was correct. The battalion's improved performance metrics, higher morale indicators, and enhanced reputation would create institutional pressure to preserve the cultural changes they had implemented. Captain Kim raised an important practical question. "Ma'am, what advice do you have for maintaining these standards when we face new challenges, or when personnel changes bring in people who aren't familiar with our approach?" "The same advice I gave you 6 months ago," Sarah replied. "Model the behavior you want to see, address assumptions and biases when you encounter them, and always focus on results rather than appearances." She looked around at the soldiers who had become not just her subordinates, but her partners in creating organizational change. "Remember that every comment you make, every decision you support, and every assumption you challenge teaches other soldiers what kind of unit this is and what standards you expect." As the discussion continued, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. What had started with an awkward confrontation about access and assumptions had evolved into a comprehensive transformation of how the battalion approached leadership, problem-solving, and organizational effectiveness. The real measure of their success wasn't in the awards, promotion rates, or performance metrics, though those were certainly gratifying. The real success was visible in the confidence of soldiers who knew their contributions mattered, the effectiveness of leaders who had learned to focus on competence rather than conformity, and the resilience of an organization that could adapt and improve continuously. "One final thought," Sarah said as the group began to disperse back to their various duties. 6 months ago, assumptions about what a colonel should look like nearly prevented me from entering this base. Today, this battalion is being studied as a model for effective leadership and organizational performance." She paused, letting the contrast sink in. "That transformation didn't happen because I proved I could fit traditional expectations of leadership. It happened because all of you learned to evaluate leadership based on results rather than assumptions." As Sarah prepared for her transition to brigade command, she felt confident that the lessons learned at Fort Braxton would continue to influence how the Army thought about leadership, diversity, and organizational effectiveness. More importantly, she knew that the soldiers she was leaving behind had internalized principles that would make them better leaders throughout their careers. The woman who had been denied access because she didn't look like a colonel was departing as a brigadier general, leaving behind a battalion that had learned to recognize competence regardless of what package it came in. The transformation was complete, but its impact would continue spreading throughout the Army for years to come.